Darren Wilson grew up in Cleveland, in a neighborhood where old houses hadn't seen repairs in decades. His childhood was spent around peeling paint and cracked sidewalks that stretched past empty factory lots. His dad Leroy worked as an electrician at the local steel mill and often brought Darren along, showing him how wiring worked. One day, when Darren was 13, Leroy didn't come home. A short circuit in an outdated system took his life. The bosses called it an accident, but Darren's mom, Clara, blamed the people who didn't want to spend money on upgrades. After that, cash dried up, and Clara started cleaning offices at night so Darren and his brother Casey wouldn't go hungry. Leroy always told his son that a job should be done right, no cutting corners. He taught Darren how to handle wires, check every detail, even if nobody else bothered. Those lessons stuck with him, especially after his dad was gone. At 16, Darren dropped out of school because Clara couldn't support the family alone. He got a gig as an electrician's helper on a construction site where the pay was low, but at least steady. He hauled heavy coils of cable, learned to solder connections, and figured out blueprints that other workers barely glanced at. By 22, Darren was a full electrician, diploma or not, and people on the sites respected his eye for detail. But that didn't stop foremen from looking down on him. Young, black, no degree, he was an outsider to them. "What, you think you're smarter than everyone here?" they'd toss at him with a smirk, and Darren knew it wasn't just about the paper. One day, a big project landed on the site, a new warehouse on the city's edge, and with it came an engineer from Chicago, Andrew Crawford. This guy was a name in the circles that handed out awards for slick presentations. At the crew meeting, Crawford talked up his project, holding a tablet and pacing in a crisp shirt in front of everyone. Darren sat in the back, flipping through the blueprint, and spotted something off, too much load, on a weak bus bar. He raised his hand to ask, "Mr. Crawford, are you sure that line can handle that current?" The room went quiet, all eyes on him. Crawford looked at Darren, narrowed his eyes, and let out a scoff. "Who's this curious kid?" he said, sizing Darren up with obvious disdain. "You think you can tell me how to design projects, huh? Go twist some wires, that's where you belong." Laughter broke out. Someone even patted Darren on the back like it was a joke. Crawford added, "Leave the big stuff to people who know what they're doing." Darren clenched his fists, feeling something tighten inside. He wasn't used to staying quiet when he saw trouble, and he knew this engineer had just glossed over a mistake that could kill. That night, he sat at home, studying the blueprint under a lamp, and saw he was right. The wiring was a hazard. Sleep didn't come because all he could see was his dad, and that day his life ended over someone else's carelessness. Darren decided he wouldn't let it slide, not even if Crawford and the whole crew laughed him off. This wasn't just an argument, it was a chance to prove his voice mattered more than they thought. Darren Wilson, by 22, was someone the construction crews respected for his work. He bounced around jobs all over Cleveland, warehouses, apartment buildings, places where electrical systems were often the weakest link. He learned wiring not from books, but by doing, pulling old cables out of walls and running new ones in the rain. His co-workers noticed he always double-checked blueprints, even if it meant staying late after a shift. "What, you scared we're all going to get fried?" his buddy Tony would tease, but Darren just shrugged and kept at it. His reputation built up slow but steady, especially with guys who'd seen him catch mistakes others missed. One time, on a retail store job, he spotted a grounding wire hooked up wrong and pushed to redo it. The foreman, a white guy named Danny, rolled his eyes at first, muttering, "You're not an engineer, Wilson." But when the inspector later said it saved them a fine, Danny didn't say a word, though he didn't apologize either. Darren got used to moments like that. His skin and lack of a degree always spoke louder than his work. On sites, he dealt with all kinds of attitudes, and not all of it was about the job. Sometimes he'd hear snide remarks like, "Where'd you get so smart, run off from Harvard?" It sounded like a joke, but there was an edge to it. Once a new guy fresh from the suburbs asked point blank, "How'd you even end up here? This ain't your spot, right?" Darren kept it cool, said, "My spot's where I work," and walked off to fix a breaker box. He didn't want fights, but inside, those words burned, reminding him he was still an outsider to plenty of people. At home, Darren lived with his mom and brother in a cramped apartment where damp walls peeled the wallpaper. Clara still worked nights, and Casey, 15, went to school talking about college someday. Darren brought home most of his paycheck, keeping just enough for gas and food. Late at night, he'd sit at the table, poring over old blueprints he'd snagged from work, figuring out how things ticked. He didn't tell anyone, but he wanted to know more than a helper was supposed to. One evening, Tony came up after a shift and said, "Man, you really get this stuff, you could go further." Darren smirked. Where am I going with no degree? Tony shrugged. Who cares about a degree? You're better than half these know-it-alls already. It was one of those rare times Darren felt seen as more than just a pair of hands. But the bosses saw it different. To them, he was just labor, not someone who should weigh in on big decisions. By the time the warehouse project rolled in, Darren had spent years proving he belonged on those sites. He didn't chase praise, just wanted his work to keep people safe, not put them at risk. After that run-in with Crawford, he got even sharper, knowing guys like that engineer rarely listened to anyone below their pay grade. He started carrying a little notebook, jotting down anything he noticed in the plans, not for anyone else, just for himself. He figured it'd come in handy someday, especially if he had to face down another suit who thought his voice didn't count. After that meeting with Crawford, Darren couldn't just let it go like it never happened. He got home that night, tossed his jacket on a chair, and flipped on the light in his tiny room. The warehouse blueprint sat on the table, and he started studying it again, tracing the wiring lines with his finger. The longer he looked, the clearer it got. The main bus bar was overloaded, not just a mistake, but a fire waiting to happen. Darren knew stuff like that couldn't slide, not after what went down with his dad. Next day on the site, he kept his head down, did his job, but inside he was steaming. Some guys razzied him about his question to Crawford, one even said, "What, you an engineer now, Darren?" He brushed it off, but he felt the stares, not all of them friendly. A new worker, white guy with a neck tattoo, grumbled as he passed, "Stay in your lane, got it?" Darren clenched his jaw, knowing it wasn't just about work, it was about who they thought he was, a black kid with no business speaking up. A couple days later, Crawford showed up again to go over details with the crew and bosses. He stood there in his fancy jacket, talking about how his project would make Cleveland better. "This isn't just a warehouse, it's the future," he said, jabbing at his tablet with the plans. Darren listened from the side, noticing how Crawford praised his engineer team like the workers on the ground were invisible. At one point, he threw in, "We need people with degrees, not folks who think they know it all from tinkering in a garage." That hit Darren harder than he expected, bringing back all the times his background got thrown in his face. He remembered a white inspector on another job once saying, "You do all right for your kind," then walking off without a second look. Darren let it slide then, but not now. He raised his hand, keeping his voice steady. "What about the wiring in the south wing? Can it handle the load?" Crawford paused, looked at Darren, and rolled his eyes like it was a gag. "You again, huh?" he said with a smirk, glancing around like he wanted the others to laugh. "Listen, kid, I studied at Illinois, designed buildings in Chicago, and you're schooling me on wiring? Maybe you should draw the plans yourself." A few guys chuckled, someone clapped. Darren felt his face heat up, but he wasn't backing down. "I'm not schooling, I'm asking," he said, locking eyes with Crawford. "If that bus bar fries, the whole warehouse could go dark or worse." Crawford snorted, waved him off, and said, "You done? We've got real work here." But Darren caught an engineer off to the side, frowning at his laptop. That gave him a boost. He knew he was right and wasn't about to let it go. That night, he sat at home again, running numbers in the notebook he always carried. He wasn't an engineer, but years on the job taught him where systems could break. Darren got that Crawford didn't just mess up. He wouldn't listen because all he saw was a black worker, not someone who could be right. This wasn't just about wiring anymore. It was about how guys like him always got pushed aside, even when lives were on the line. The morning after his sleepless night, Darren showed up at the site with a plan locked in his head. He'd spent hours checking the warehouse blueprint in his notebook, and the numbers backed him up. The wiring in the south wing was a disaster waiting to happen. He didn't want to stir things up again, but the idea of someone getting hurt because of that mistake kept him on edge. He thought about his dad, how he died over someone else's sloppiness, and knew he couldn't stay quiet. They called another meeting on the site to go over final details before work kicked off. Crawford stood up front like always, tablet in hand, talking about timelines and budgets. Darren sat mid-row, gripping his notebook in his pocket, where he'd written everything down. When Crawford wrapped up, he asked if there were questions, clearly expecting nothing. Darren stood, feeling every eye on him again. "It's about the south wing," he started, keeping his voice clear. "That bus bar won't handle the load. I ran the numbers." Crawford winced like he'd been stepped on and cut in. "Listen, kid, we've been over this." He turned to the crowd with a smirk. "Anyone else want to play engineer today?" A few guys laughed, but Darren didn't sit. "I'm not playing," he said, staring right at Crawford. "If that line burns out, the whole warehouse could catch fire, and you know it." The room went quiet. The chuckles died. Someone coughed. Crawford pressed his lips tight, then waved at one of his assistants, a young engineer named Logan. Check what he's got, since he's so smart, he snapped, annoyance dripping off him. Logan, a skinny guy with glasses, walked over and took Darren's notebook. While he punched the data into his laptop, Darren stood there, sweat trickling down his back. Crawford glared at him, like he was thinking, "You're nobody." After a couple minutes, Logan looked up and said, "He's right." His voice was soft, but it hit the silence like a gunshot. "The bus bar's overloaded by 20% over spec. It's a risk." Crawford froze, his face went pale, then he forced out, "You serious? We missed this." Logan nodded, and whispers started rippling through the crowd. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording. Darren caught it out of the corner of his eye. "It's a calculation glitch, it happens," Crawford stammered, but he didn't sound so sure anymore. Darren watched him, thinking this guy would have never owned up without proof. He knew Crawford saw him as just a black worker who got lucky pointing out a flaw. One of his buddies, Tony, slapped him on the shoulder and whispered, "You smoked him, man." But Darren didn't feel like celebrating, he just felt wiped out. By the end of the day, the meeting video was bouncing around online. Someone posted it with a caption, "Cleveland electrician versus Chicago engineer." Tony showed it to Darren on his phone during lunch. "You're a star now," Tony said, but Darren just shook his head. He didn't want the noise, but he knew there was no going back. At home, he turned on the news and saw his face on the screen. A reporter was saying how a regular worker showed the elite what's what. Darren shut it off, figuring this was only the start. When that meeting video hit the web, Darren had no clue how fast things would spin out of control. By the next morning, his phone was buzzing nonstop, co-workers, friends, even some cousins from Columbus texting, "That you taking down, Crawford?" He scrolled through, found a link to the clip, and watched it. There he was, standing in front of the crew, notebook in hand, with Logan's voice backing him up. The caption read, "Worker versus engineer, who won?" Darren shut off his phone, feeling his stomach tighten. At the site, the vibe was different. Tony and a couple guys slapped his back, saying, "You showed those suits, what's up?" But others avoided his gaze or muttered behind him. An older worker, a white guy named Roy, tossed out as he walked by, "Don't get cocky, kid, this ain't your league." Darren didn't answer, but he knew Roy wasn't just talking shop. He saw a black guy stepping out of line. That feeling had trailed him his whole life. By lunch, local news picked up the story, and reporters were crowding the site gate. They shouted his name, begged for a word, but Darren walked past, head down. At home, he flipped on the TV and caught a headline, "Cleveland electrician exposes engineer." The anchor went on about how a regular guy proved experience beats degrees. Darren turned it off, thinking they were missing the point. This wasn't about being a hero, it was about keeping history from repeating with his dad. That night, he checked social media and regretted it instantly. Hundreds of comments under the video. Some cheered like, "That's what a real worker looks like." But others stung. "Lucky break for a black guy pointing out a fluke, huh?" Or, "No education, he's nothing, just making noise." Darren read it, feeling old wounds rip open. His skin always gave people a reason to jab, even when he was right. He tossed the phone on the couch and tried to sleep, but it didn't come. Next day, the site manager, a short balding guy named Greg, pulled him aside. "Look, you're in the spotlight now, this is serious," he said. "Big shots are watching, reporters calling, even the union asked about you." Darren nodded, then asked, "What about Crawford?" Greg shrugged, "Quiet so far, but he's not happy." Darren didn't care if Crawford was happy. He just wanted the mistake fixed, end of story. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Andrew Crawford sat in his office, staring at the same video. His secretary asked for the third time that day if he'd talk to the press, but he waved her off. Inside, he was fuming, not just at Darren, but at the dent in his reputation. He figured the kid was a fluke, some punk who got lucky, but Logan's words about the overload stuck with him. Crawford was used to guys like Darren, black, no degree, staying out of his lane, and now he didn't know how to process this. By week's end, the story hit national channels, and Darren's phone started ringing from unknown numbers. Some offered interviews, others just wanted to chat. He turned it off and told his mom, "I didn't ask for this, Clara." She looked at him and said, "Maybe it found you anyway." Darren didn't know what to think, but he could feel the buzz around him growing louder. After the video took off, Darren started noticing things shifting around him. The next week, he got called to a local electricians' union meeting in Cleveland. He didn't want to go, but Tony pushed, "You're not just one of us anymore, people want to hear you." Darren went along, more curious than eager to be front and center. The room had about 50 people, workers in beat-up jackets, a few tech school students, even a couple reporters with notepads. When they asked him to say something, he stood up, feeling out of place. "I didn't plan any of this," he started, looking at the faces in front of him. "Just saw a mistake, spoke up, because I know what happens when nobody listens." He talked about his dad, how he died from someone else's carelessness, and wrapped up, "If we stay quiet, we pay later." The room went silent, then someone clapped, and it spread through the rows. Darren sat down, thinking it felt weird but real. From then on, they kept calling him, worker meetups, colleges, even a radio spot. One time, he got invited to a tech school on the city's edge, where mostly white students listened, jaws dropped. A girl with short hair asked, "How'd you dare take on someone like Crawford?" Darren shrugged. Wasn't about daring, just didn't want anyone hurt. But he saw something bigger in their eyes. To them, he was proof the system could crack. Online, the buzz didn't die down. Someone started a page called Voices from the Field, posting stories of workers ignored for years. Darren became the face of it, though he never asked to be. Comments rolled in, "Finally, someone stuck it to those snobs." But others hit harder. "Black guy thinks he's an engineer, hilarious." Or, "Not his win, just dumb luck." Darren read it, knowing for a lot of them, his skin outweighed his words. At the sight, the split got clearer. Tony and a few others were proud, but guys like Roy turned colder. One day, Roy said loud enough for everyone, "Big star now, huh? Just don't forget where you're from." Darren met his eyes and shot back, "I don't, do you?" Roy walked off, mumbling under his breath. Darren knew to guys like Roy, he was trouble, a black man who dared look up. Soon, the tech school students kicked off a campaign to get workers involved in project reviews. They called it Hear the Builders and collected signatures across Ohio. Darren watched it on the news, stunned at how his moment grew into something huge. A woman from the union called one day and said, "You've lit a fire. People want you to keep talking." He didn't know what to say. He wasn't a speaker, but he felt silence wasn't an option anymore. In Chicago, Andrew Crawford watched from a distance. He still hadn't talked to the press, but he scanned headlines daily, seeing his name tied to a flop. Colleagues called, asking what he thought, but he brushed them off. Inside, doubt crept in. Maybe Darren did no more than he'd figured? It gnawed at him, admitting a black worker with no degree got the better of him. Crawford sat in his office, staring out the window, feeling his world wobble, and not knowing how to steady it. The buzz around Darren Wilson didn't fade, and a couple weeks after the campaign kicked off, he got a surprise message. Andrew Crawford sent him a short note, asking to meet in Cleveland at a cafe near the site. Darren stared at the screen, unsure what to make of it. This engineer had been silent for months, and now he wanted to talk. He showed it to his mom, and Clara said, "Go hear him out." Darren agreed, more curious than ready to patch things up. The meeting happened in a small cafe with worn chairs and the smell of coffee. Crawford sat by the window, in a plain gray hoodie, no trace of his usual polish. When Darren walked in, he stood and offered a handshake. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice quieter than at those meetings. Darren shook his hand, sat across, and asked, "Why am I here?" Crawford sighed, staring into his cup. "I've been thinking about that day a lot," he started. "You were right, I was wrong, and it took me a while to get that." Darren listened, not cutting in, though he felt himself tense up. Crawford went on, "I'm used to guys like you staying out of my business. That's not an excuse, just how it's been." Darren nodded, knowing guys like you meant his skin and his place. "You wanted me quiet because I don't look like you," he said evenly. Crawford winced, but didn't argue. "Maybe so, but you made me think, and not just me." They talked for almost an hour, about work, mistakes, how projects often ignore the people building them. Crawford admitted he'd gone over his plans after that day and found a couple more weak spots. Darren shared how his dad died from someone's carelessness, the first time he'd told anyone outside family. By the end, Crawford said, "I want to help with your campaign. Not for show, but to really change something." Darren looked at him and said, "If it's not just talk, let's do it." A month later, Cleveland launched Build Together, a program from the union and the tech school. Workers like Darren got trained in design basics, while students hit the sites to learn hands-on. The opening drew a crowd, electricians, carpenters, even some city officials. Darren got the mic and kept it simple. "I grew up where nobody heard us. Now they do, and it's not just about me." People clapped, and he thought of his dad and Clara watching from the front row. Crawford was there too, off to the side, no cameras or mics. After, he walked up to Darren and said, "You started this, I picked it up. Maybe that's how it works." Darren nodded, feeling the wall between them gone. The program took off. In a year, dozens of workers and students went through it, and Ohio started tweaking rules to bring experienced folks into project reviews. Darren stayed on the site, but spoke louder now. He helped teach in the program, showing newbies how small details matter. The reporters moved on, the hype died down, but the work lived. One day, a plaque went up at the tech school, built by those who work and know. Below it were two names, Darren Wilson and Andrew Crawford. Darren saw it, smirked, and went back to his job. Thank you for watching, and now, questions for you viewers. Do you think experience really outweighs a degree, or is it just a pretty tale? Has anyone ever overlooked you because of your looks? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't hold back. Your replies could strike a chord. Thanks for hanging out with us.